She wore red to my sister's funeral. Not burgundy, not wine. Blood red.
She wore red.
And she walked down that church aisle on my brother-in-law's arm like she belonged there. Like she had every right to sit in the family pew. Like my sister's body wasn't lying cold in that casket, just 20 feet away. 300 people gasped.
We found the originals.
My mother made a sound I will never
Exhibit
forget.
A.
And Garrett? He didn't shed a single tear. He checked his phone twice during the eulogy.
You have the right to remain silent.
But here's what
Anything
nobody
you say
knew
can
that
be used
day.
against you.
My sister Margot had discovered his affair 3 months before she died. She knew about the other woman. She knew about his secret bank accounts. She knew about his plan to take her inheritance and disappear. And she did something about it. She changed her will in secret. She gathered evidence. She documented everything. Because Margot wasn't just a victim. She was a woman with a plan. What Garrett didn't know was that the drunk driver who killed my pregnant sister, he received a $5,000 wire transfer 2 days before the accident. And that money trail led straight back to my brother-in-law's firm. This is the story of how a dead woman destroyed her killer from beyond the grave. How a grieving sister uncovered murder, disguised as tragedy, and how $4.2 million ended up funding justice instead of rewarding evil. Stay with me until the end. Because the moment that lawyer read my sister's will out loud, Garrett's face was something I will remember for the rest of my life. The lesson: this story carries a powerful truth. Document everything. Trust your instincts. And never underestimate a woman who has been betrayed. Margot could not save her own life, but she made absolutely certain that her death would not be in vain. She turned her pain into protection, her grief into evidence, her love into a legacy that continues saving lives today. The meaning of this story is simple but profound. Evil does not always win. Sometimes justice arrives late. Sometimes it comes from unexpected places. But for those who plan and prepare and refuse to stay silent, victory is possible even from beyond the grave. She wore red to my sister's funeral. Not crimson, not wine, not some tasteful burgundy that might pass for a mourning color in certain lighting. No, this woman walked into St. Andrew's Church wearing a dress the color of fresh blood, and she did it on the arm of my brother-in-law. The September air carried the heavy sweetness of white lilies, Margot's favorite flower. 300 people had come to say goodbye to my baby sister, and the sanctuary overflowed with arrangements sent from students, parents, fellow teachers, and friends who remembered her kindness. The scent should have been comforting. Instead, it made my stomach turn. I stood at the church entrance in my black dress, accepting condolences with a composure I did not feel. My husband David had taken our daughter Lily to find seats. My parents waited in the front pew, my mother's hands folded in her lap, my father's jaw tight with the effort of holding himself together. Margot was 32 years old, 7 months pregnant, dead because a drunk driver ran a red light on a Tuesday afternoon. At least, that was what we believed then. The whispers started at the back of the church, a ripple of sound moving forward like a fouaf. I turned toward the entrance, and my world tilted on its axis. Garrett walked down the center aisle, my sister's husband of 3 years, the man who had cried at their wedding, the man who had rubbed Margot's feet when they swelled during pregnancy, the man who had painted the nursery yellow because they wanted to be surprised by the baby's gender. He was not alone. A woman clung to his arm, young, blonde, beautiful in that obvious way that requires effort and money and time. Her dress stopped several inches above her knees. Her heels clicked against the marble floor with each step. My mother made a sound beside me, something between a gasp and a moan, the noise a wounded animal makes. "Who is that?" someone whispered. "I know," another voice answered. "That is his assistant, from the firm." I watched Garrett guide this woman toward the front of the church, toward the family pew, toward the space reserved for those who loved Margot most. He seated her right beside where my parents would sit. My hands began to shake. I gripped the funeral program until the paper crumpled in my fist. Jolene appeared at my side, Margot's best friend since their freshman year at the University of Virginia. Loud, loyal, currently vibrating with barely contained fury. "Tell me I am not seeing what I am seeing," she hissed. "You are seeing it. I am going to kill him, not here." My voice sounded foreign to my own ears. Calm, steady, deadly. Not yet. The organ began to play. People found their seats. I walked to the front of the church on legs that felt disconnected from my body. I slid into the pew beside my mother. Garrett sat 3 feet away. The woman in red sat between us. She smelled like expensive perfume, something floral and musky that clashed with the lilies. Pastor Hendricks took his place at the pulpit. He spoke about Margot's kindness, her dedication to her students, her excitement about becoming a mother. He talked about the nursery she had painted by hand, adding butterflies and birds to the sunny yellow walls. I could not stop staring at the back of the woman's head. Her blonde hair was styled in perfect waves, not a strand out of place. Garrett checked his phone, twice, during the eulogy for his dead pregnant wife. I watched his face for any sign of grief, any crack in the polished exterior. His eyes remained dry. His expression remained neutral. He might have been sitting through a particularly boring business meeting. My father rose to speak. His voice broke 3 times. He talked about teaching Margot to ride a bicycle, about watching her graduate from college, about the day she called to tell him she was pregnant. "I am going to be a grandfather," he said. Those were the happiest words she ever spoke to me. My mother sobbed quietly into a handkerchief. Garrett scrolled through something on his phone. Then it was my turn. I walked to the pulpit on unsteady legs. I looked out at the sea of faces. 300 people who loved my sister, who would miss her laugh and her art and her gentle way of seeing beauty in everything. I looked at Garrett. Our eyes met. Something in his expression made my stomach turn. Something that looked almost like relief, like satisfaction, like smugness. The thought came unbidden, terrifying in its clarity. What if it was not an accident? I pushed the thought away, took a breath, opened my mouth to speak. My hands trembled holding the notes I had written. I smoothed the paper against the podium, folded it, unfolded it, folded it again. The edges were soft now, worn from hours of nervous handling. I had read these words 200 times in the past 3 days. I still could not believe I had to say them out loud. Margot was more than my sister, I began. She was my best friend, my confidant, the person who knew all my secrets and loved me anyway. I talked about our childhood, about playing in the backyard of our parents' house, about the time she convinced me to let her give me a haircut, and I ended up looking like a sheep that had lost a fight with a lawnmower. Laughter rippled through the congregation. Good. Margot would have wanted laughter. She had a gift, I continued. Not just for art, though her paintings were extraordinary. She had a gift for seeing the best in people, for finding light in the darkest corners, for loving without reservation. I paused, looked at the closed casket draped in white roses. She was going to be an amazing mother, I said. She talked about it all the time, about teaching her daughter to paint, about reading her bedtime stories, about all the adventures they would have together. My voice cracked. I took a breath, steadied myself. Margot loved fiercely. She believed in second chances. She saw potential where others saw only flaws. I did not look at Garrett when I said this. I did not need to. My sister deserved a long and happy life. She deserved to hold her baby girl. She deserved to grow old surrounded by people who loved her as much as she loved them. Instead, we are here, saying goodbye too soon. I stepped down from the pulpit, returned to my seat. The woman in red shifted slightly to make room. The funeral continued. Hymns were sung. Prayers were offered. The casket was carried out by 6 men in dark suits. I followed behind with my family. Garrett walked beside us. The woman in red stayed close. At the cemetery, I stood beside the grave and watched them lower my sister into the ground. The September sun beat down hot and bright. Inappropriate weather for a funeral. Garrett threw the first handful of dirt onto the casket. His face remained impassive. The woman in red waited by the cars. After the burial, people began moving toward their vehicles. The reception would be held at my parents' house. Food had been prepared. Stories would be shared. Life would begin the terrible process of moving forward. Garrett approached me. "Caroline," he said. His voice was smooth, sympathetic. "I wanted to know when we might schedule the reading of the will." My blood turned to ice. "The will," I repeated. Margot had assets, the trust from her grandmother, her life insurance. These things need to be addressed. "My sister has been dead for 5 days," I said slowly. "Her body is barely cold." Garrett's expression did not change. "I understand this is difficult, but Margot would have wanted me to be taken care of. She loved me. She would have wanted her wishes honored quickly." Behind him, the woman in red checked her phone. I looked at my brother-in-law, really looked at him, saw the calculation behind his sympathetic mask, saw the greed barely hidden beneath his concerned expression. "I will let you know when Theodore is ready," I said. I turned and walked away. Behind me, I heard Garrett sigh, patient, long-suffering, the sound of a man dealing with an unreasonable woman. At my parents' house, 300 people crowded into rooms that felt too small. Casseroles covered every surface. Wine glasses clinked. Stories about Margot filled the air. Garrett moved through the crowd, accepting condolences. He kept his hand on the small of the woman's back, guiding her, introducing her. "This is Tiffany," I heard him say. "She has been such a support to me during this difficult time." My mother stood in the kitchen arranging cookies on a tray. Her hands shook badly enough that several cookies fell to the floor. "I need to ask you something," I said quietly. Dorothy Ashford did not look up. "What is it?" "That woman, Tiffany. Did you know about her?" My mother's hands went still. The cookies lay scattered on the counter. "Know what?" she asked carefully. "Mom." Silence stretched between us. The noise of the reception filtered in from the other rooms. Laughter, tears, the clink of glasses. "I suspected," my mother finally said. "For about a year, maybe longer, the floor seemed to tilt beneath my feet." "Did Margot know?" She would not hear it. "I tried to tell her once, 6 months ago. She said I was being paranoid. That Garrett loved her, that I was seeing problems where none existed." I leaned against the counter, tried to breathe. "She kept the baby's gender a secret," my mother continued. "Told everyone she wanted to be surprised. But I think the truth is that Garrett was never interested enough to ask, never excited enough to find out. I thought about the nursery, the yellow paint, the butterflies and birds. Margot had painted that room alone. I remembered now. Garrett was at a conference, or working late, or dealing with some crisis at the firm. He was always dealing with some crisis at the firm. "Why did you never tell me?" I asked. My mother finally looked up. Her eyes were red, swollen from days of crying. "Because I was not certain. Because Margot was happy. Or, she seemed happy, and I did not want to be the one to destroy that happiness if I was wrong. I thought about my sister, about the way she smiled in photographs from the past year, about the way that smile never quite reached her eyes. I should have looked closer. I should have asked more questions. I should have protected her. The guilt settled into my chest like a stone. Heavy. Permanent. In the other room, Garrett laughed at something someone said. The sound was loud, comfortable. The laugh of a man without a care in the world. I watched him through the doorway, watched him smile and nod, and accept the sympathy of people who did not know the truth. What have you done, I thought. What have you done to my sister? I did not know the answer yet, but I was going to find out. The reception dragged on for hours. People ate, drank, shared memories of Margot that made everyone cry and laugh in equal measure. I moved through the crowd like a ghost, shaking hands, accepting hugs, saying the right things at the right times. All the while I watched Garrett. He played the grieving husband perfectly. Tears appeared at exactly the right moments. His voice broke when telling stories about Margot. He held Tiffany's hand like she was the only thing keeping him standing. By 6 o'clock, my head was pounding. I needed to escape, to breathe, to think. I slipped away from the living room and climbed the stairs to Margot's childhood bedroom. My mother had preserved it exactly as it was when Margot left for college. Posters of Van Gogh's sunflowers covered one wall. Shelves overflowed with art books and sketch pads. A faded blue ribbon from the state fair hung above the dresser, awarded for a watercolor she had painted at 14. I sat on the bed. The mattress creaked under my weight. The room smelled like dust and old paper and something floral that might have been the remnants of Margot's perfume from years ago. I pulled out my phone, opened my camera roll, scrolled through photos of my sister from the past year. There, 3 months before she died. A family dinner at my parents' house. Everyone crowded around the dining room table. Turkey and stuffing and all the trimmings. Margot sat beside Garrett. Her hand rested on her belly, round at 4 months pregnant. She smiled at the camera, but the smile did not reach her eyes. I zoomed in on her face, studied the tension around her mouth, the slight crease between her brows. I scrolled to another photo. 2 months before she died. A baby shower thrown by Jolene. Pink and blue decorations everywhere because they were keeping the gender a surprise. Margot stood in the center of a group of women, presents piled high on the table behind her. She held a tiny yellow onesie against her chest. Her smile was wide, genuine, but her gaze was distant, unfocused, like she was somewhere else entirely. I thought about what my mother had said, about Margot refusing to believe that Garrett was unfaithful, about the way she had dismissed the concerns as paranoia. But what if she had not dismissed them? What if she had believed them and simply pretended not to? You knew, I whispered to the empty room. Didn't you, Margot? The door opened behind me. I turned quickly, shoving my phone into my pocket. Jolene stood in the doorway. Her makeup was smeared from crying. Her black dress was wrinkled. I thought I might find you here, she said. I needed a minute. Jolene crossed the room and sat beside me on the bed. The springs groaned in protest. I cannot believe he brought her, she said. To the funeral, to the reception. He introduced her to Margot's colleagues from the school. I know. Do you think Margot knew about the affair? I looked at the photos still visible on my phone screen. Margot's distant gaze, her smile that did not reach her eyes. I think she might have. Jolene was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. She called me the week before the accident, asked if I could recommend a divorce attorney. What? She said it was for a friend, someone from her book club. But Margot was a terrible liar, always had been. I stared at my sister's best friend. Why didn't you tell me this before? Because I wasn't sure. And then she died, and I thought maybe I misunderstood. Did she say anything else? Jolene's brow furrowed. She asked about asset protection, about what happens to property when a marriage ends, about whether a spouse could be removed from a will. The stone in my chest grew heavier. Margot had been planning something, preparing for something, and now she was dead. Coincidence, a voice in my head suggested. But I did not believe in coincidences. Not anymore. 3 days later, I drove to Margot and Garrett's house. The Cape Cod-style home, sat on a tree-lined street in a neighborhood full of young families. White siding, black shutters, a wraparound porch that Margot had loved at first sight. Garrett's car was not in the driveway. Good. He was probably at Tiffany's apartment, or back at the office, pretending to work through his grief. I used my spare key to let myself in. The house smelled stale, empty, like no one had opened a window or cooked a meal in days. I walked through the living room, past the kitchen where Margot had made Sunday dinners and birthday cakes and Valentine's Day chocolates, past the dining room where they had hosted Thanksgiving last year. I climbed the stairs, paused at the door to the nursery. Yellow walls glowed in the afternoon light. Butterflies and birds covered every surface, painted in Margot's delicate hand. A white crib stood against one wall. A rocking chair sat by the window. A mobile hung above the crib. Stars and moons in silver and gold. Margot had made it herself. I stood in the doorway for a long moment. Let the grief wash over me. My sister would never rock her baby in that chair, would never watch her daughter reach for those stars and moons, would never teach her to paint butterflies and birds. I wiped my eyes, kept moving. Margot's art studio was at the end of the hall, a spare bedroom she had converted into her creative space. Canvases covered every wall. Paint supplies cluttered every surface. The smell of turpentine hung in the air. I stepped inside, closed the door behind me. The studio was chaos and beauty combined. Half-finished paintings leaned against the walls. Sketches were pinned to a corkboard. A jar of brushes sat beside a palette smeared with dried colors. One small painting caught my eye. A woman alone in a garden, her face turned away from the viewer, her shoulders hunched forward. Loneliness radiated from every brushstroke. Margot had painted this recently. The oils were still slightly tacky in places. I studied the image, felt my heart break all over again. Then I noticed the floorboard. It was slightly raised, just enough to catch my attention. I remembered this hiding spot from our childhood. Margot had discovered the loose board when she was 12. She had kept her most precious secrets there. Diary entries, love letters from boys at school, the $50 she had saved to buy Mom a birthday present. I knelt beside the board, worked my fingers under the edge, pried it up. Inside the space beneath the floor, I found a leather journal, a manila envelope, and a cheap cell phone I had never seen before. My hands trembled as I lifted the journal, opened it to the first page. The entry was dated 4 months before Margot died. I found the texts today she had written. 2 years. He has been sleeping with her for 2 years. Our entire marriage. The words blurred. I blinked hard, forced myself to keep reading. I was pregnant within 6 months of the wedding. He was already cheating. Every time he touched me, he had just come from touching her. Every time he told me he loved me, he was lying. I thought about confronting him. But then what? He will deny it. Gaslight me. Tell me I am hormonal and paranoid. I have seen him do it before. Twist reality until I do not trust my own eyes. I sat back on my heels. The studio spun around me. My sister knew. My sister knew everything. And she had not told a single person. I read more. Entry after entry of Margot processing her discovery in secret. Planning in silence. Preparing for a confrontation that would never come. I cannot leave, she wrote. Not yet. I need to think. Plan. He married me for the money. I see that now. If I file for divorce, he will fight dirty. He will use the baby against me. He will drag this through courts for years. Dad knows a different attorney. Not the family one. Someone Garrett would never think to check. I am meeting her tomorrow. I flipped forward, found more entries. Patricia Holloway is brilliant. She understands exactly what I am dealing with. She says, I need evidence, documentation, proof that will hold up in court. I am gathering everything: bank statements, text messages, credit card receipts. He thinks I am stupid, an airhead artist who does not understand finances. He leaves his laptop open, never changes his passwords, never thinks I would look. I close the journal. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it. The manila envelope contained exactly what Margot described: copies of bank statements, printed text messages, photographs of hotel receipts, evidence of an affair that had lasted their entire marriage. And at the bottom of the envelope, a sealed letter. For Caroline, it read in Margot's handwriting, "To be opened after the will is read." I stared at the letter. My heart pounded in my chest. What did you do, Margot? The burner phone sat heavy in my palm. I turned it on. The battery was low, but not dead. Text messages filled the screen. Conversations with someone identified only as PH, Patricia Holloway. "The documents are ready," one message read. "We can file whenever you are prepared." Another message, dated 2 weeks before the accident: "I think he suspects something. He has been watching me, asking questions." And Margot's reply: "If anything happens to me, Caroline will find the evidence. She will know what to do." The stone in my chest shattered, reformed as something else: rage. Pure, white-hot, consuming rage. I gathered everything: the journal, the envelope, the burner phone. I placed them carefully in my bag. Then I drove to the beach where Margot and I had played as children. I sat in my car with the engine off, the windows down. Salt air filled my lungs. I did not cry. I was past crying. A seagull landed on my hood, stared at me with beady eyes, flew away. I picked up my phone, dialed my father's number. He answered on the second ring. "Caroline? What is wrong?" "Dad," I said, "we need to talk. About Margot. About what she asked you to do." The smell of old books and leather filled my father's study. Sunlight streamed through windows that looked out over the backyard where Margot and I had once chased fireflies on summer nights. I sat across from my father in the worn armchair I had occupied 1,000 times before, as a child doing homework while he reviewed patient charts, as a teenager asking for advice about boys, as an adult sharing news of my own pregnancy. Now I sat here asking about conspiracy and betrayal. "She came to me 3 months before she died," my father said. His voice was low, rough, like speaking these words physically hurt him. "She sat in that same chair and told me everything." I waited. Let him tell the story in his own time. She knew about the affair, had known for weeks. She had been gathering evidence, documenting everything. She said she needed my help. What kind of help? To change her will, quietly, without Garrett knowing. My father rose from his desk, walked to the window. His shoulders were stooped in a way I had never noticed before, like grief had added 20 pounds to his frame. "She was afraid," he continued, "not of leaving him. She was ready to do that. She was afraid of what he would do when she tried. Did she think he would hurt her?" She never said it directly, but I could see it in her eyes. The way she flinched when she mentioned his name, the way she looked over her shoulder constantly. I thought about my sister, gentle Margot, who cried at sad commercials and rescued spiders instead of killing them, who believed in the fundamental goodness of people. What did she change in the will? My father turned to face me. "I do not know the details. She wanted it that way. Said it was better if I could honestly say I did not know. But you helped her find an attorney. Patricia Holloway, a woman I met at a conference years ago. She specializes in cases like this, quietly protecting vulnerable spouses from partners who might become dangerous during divorce proceedings." I pulled the burner phone from my bag. This was in Margot's studio. There are text messages between her and someone with the initials PH. My father nodded slowly. They were in contact constantly at the end. Patricia was helping her build a case, not just for divorce, but for full protection. Protection from what? From everything. From Garrett taking the baby, from him draining the accounts, from him using the legal system to destroy her. I stared at my father. Why did you never tell me any of this? She made me promise. She said if anyone else knew, Garrett might find out, and if Garrett found out before she was ready. He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Do you think the accident was really an accident? My father's face crumpled. The composed surgeon who had spent 40 years delivering terrible news to families finally broke. I do not know, he whispered. I lie awake every night, asking myself that question. I tell myself it was bad luck, wrong place at the wrong time, a random tragedy. But you do not believe it. He shook his head. No, I do not believe it. Silence filled the study. The weight of unspoken words pressed down on us both. What happens now? I asked. The will reading is scheduled for next week. Theodore will handle it. Theodore Brennan? The family attorney? For the official will, yes. The one Garrett knows about. But Patricia will be there as well. She has the other documents, the ones Margot created in secret. What did those documents say? My father met my eyes. Something shifted in his expression. A hardness I had never seen before. They say that justice is coming, even if it comes too late. I left my father's study with more questions than answers. The afternoon light was fading as I drove home. Trees lined the road in their September colors, reds and golds and browns that Margot would have loved to paint. My phone buzzed. A text from Garrett. Thinking of you today. Let me know if you need anything. Margot would want us to support each other through this difficult time. I stared at the message, felt my stomach turn. The man was either innocent or the finest actor I had ever encountered. At home, David met me at the door. He took one look at my face and pulled me into his arms without asking questions. The kids are at your parents' house, he said. They wanted to spend the night with Grandma. Good. That is good. I told him everything. Sat at the kitchen table, with coffee growing cold between us, and laid out the entire sordid story. Margot knew about the affair. She was gathering evidence. She changed her will in secret. She was afraid of Garrett. And then she died in a convenient accident. David listened without interruption. When I finished, he reached across the table and took my hand. What do you want to do? He asked. I want to destroy him. The words came out flat, cold. Not a wish, but a statement of fact. Then we will, David said. Whatever it takes, we will make sure he pays for what he did. I looked at my husband, the man who had stood beside me through 16 years of marriage, who had never once given me reason to doubt his loyalty, who loved me without reservation or calculation. How do I know? I asked. How do I know you are not like him? How do I know anyone is who they seem to be? David squeezed my hand. You know because I have shown you every day for 16 years, because I have never given you reason to wonder, because trust is built through actions, not words. Margot trusted Garrett. Margot was deceived, but her trust was not foolish. His betrayal was. I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding. I need to find out the truth, I said, about the accident, about whether it really was random. Then we find out, David said, together. That night I sat in our bedroom reading Margot's journal. From beginning to end, she had documented everything. The slow dawning of suspicion, the sick feeling in her gut that something was wrong, the way she had tested Garrett with small lies to see if he would tell the truth. Where were you last night? She had asked him once. Working late, he had replied. Big deadline. But his credit card statement showed dinner for two at a restaurant 30 miles away. I knew then, she wrote. I knew without knowing, but I could not face it, not yet. I was 4 months pregnant with his child. I thought maybe I was wrong. Maybe there was an explanation. There was never an explanation. 2 weeks later, she had found the text messages. 2 years, she wrote. They have been together for 2 years, since before we were engaged. He proposed to me while sleeping with her. He married me while loving her. He got me pregnant while planning a future with her. What am I? A cover story? A source of money? A convenient lie he tells himself to feel normal? I closed the journal, pressed it against my chest. The grief hit me then, not the numb shock of the funeral, not the hollow emptiness of the reception. Real grief, crushing, suffocating. My sister had spent the last months of her life alone with this terrible knowledge, carrying a child and a betrayal simultaneously, unable to trust anyone, unable to share her burden, and I had noticed nothing. I had been too busy with my own life, my job, my kids, my comfortable marriage. I had not seen the shadows gathering around my baby sister. I should have looked closer. I should have asked more questions. I should have protected her. The guilt settled into my bones, made a home there. I did not sleep that night. Instead, I read every entry in Margot's journal, every text message on the burner phone, every document in the manila envelope. By morning, I had a complete picture of my sister's final months, and I had a plan. 2 weeks after the funeral, I sat in a coffee shop 2 towns from where I lived. Across from me sat Patricia Holloway, mid-50s, silver hair, cut short, sharp eyes that missed nothing. Thank you for meeting with me, I said. Your sister spoke of you often. She trusted you completely. Said you would know what to do if anything happened to her. The words hit like a punch to the stomach. I took a breath, steadied myself. What exactly did Margot prepare? Patricia pulled a flash drive from her bag, placed it on the table between us. Everything. Bank statements showing money Garrett has been hiding in offshore accounts. Text messages spanning 2 years of his affair. Credit card receipts for hotels, jewelry, trips. Photographs of him with Tiffany Vance at locations he claimed to have visited alone. I stared at the flash drive. Such a small thing to contain so much destruction. There is more, Patricia continued. Evidence of financial misconduct at his firm. Garrett has been skimming from client accounts. Small amounts, nothing that would trigger an audit. But over time, it adds up to hundreds of thousands of dollars. She knew about that too? Patricia nodded. Margot was thorough. She understood that a man who would betray his wife might betray others as well. She was right. The evidence was damning. Garrett had been systematically embezzling from his clients to fund the affair. Expensive dinners, luxury hotels, jewelry for Tiffany, all paid for with money that did not belong to him. What about the will? Patricia's expression shifted, became almost satisfied. Margot created a completely new will 3 months before her death. She was examined by a psychiatrist beforehand to establish that she was of sound mind. There is no way Garrett can contest it on the grounds of impaired judgment. What does it say? Patricia smiled. It says that Garrett Ashford is about to learn a very painful lesson about the consequences of betrayal. I spent the next week preparing. I hired a private investigator, a former police detective named Frank Morrison. Gruff voice, no-nonsense attitude. 20 years of experience digging up information people wanted to stay buried. I gave him everything I had, the journal, the documents, the text messages. I told him about the accident and my suspicions. You want me to look into the drunk driver? He said. See if there is more to the story, yes. Could be nothing. Could be a genuine accident. I know. Frank studied me with eyes that had seen too much. But you do not believe that? No, I do not believe that. He nodded slowly. I will see what I can find. The days crawled by. The will reading approached. Garrett continued texting, continued pretending to be the grieving husband, continued asking about the timeline for settling Margot's estate. I responded to each message with carefully neutral words. I gave nothing away. Let him believe his performance was working. At night, I lay awake, replaying conversations from the past 3 years, looking for signs I had missed. There was the time Garrett had canceled dinner at the last minute. A work emergency, he had said. Margot had seemed disappointed but not surprised. There was the time he had been unreachable for an entire weekend. A company retreat, he had claimed. I remembered Margot's expression when she told me about it, a strange blankness in her eyes. There was the time he had forgotten their anniversary, had tried to cover by claiming he had something bigger planned for the following week. I had watched Margot accept the excuse with a smile that did not reach her eyes. She had known then. She must have known, and she had carried that knowledge alone, protected the rest of us from the truth. Let us believe she was happy when she was drowning. The day before the will reading, Frank Morrison called. I found something, he said. You should come to my office. I drove there immediately, sat across from him in a cramped space filled with filing cabinets and the smell of stale coffee. The drunk driver, Frank began. Marcus Webb, 42 years old, multiple DUI convictions, currently in jail awaiting trial. I know all that. Frank slid a folder across the desk. What you do not know is that he received a wire transfer of $5,000 2 days before the accident. My heart stopped. From whom? A shell company called Evergreen Holdings, LLC. Took me a while to trace it. The ownership structure is buried under layers of corporate paperwork. He flipped to a page, pointed to a highlighted name, but eventually I found this. Evergreen Holdings is connected to an investment account managed through Garrett Ashford's firm. The room tilted. I gripped the arms of my chair. He paid someone to kill my sister. I cannot prove that definitively, Frank said carefully. The money trail is murky. Garrett is smart, but it is suspicious enough that the police should take another look. What about the second payment? Frank frowned. What second payment? He received $5,000 before. You said there might have been a deal for more after the job was done. Frank checked his notes. No second payment. At least not that I have found. Maybe Garrett decided not to pay the rest. Maybe he thought he was in the clear once Margot was dead. The cruelty of it staggered me. Not just murder, cheap murder. A bargain rate assassination of my sister and her unborn child. What do I do with this? I asked. You take it to the police. Let them investigate. Do not confront Garrett yourself. Do not tip him off. And the will reading? Frank leaned back in his chair. Let it happen. Let Garrett think he is getting away with it. Let him relax. Comfortable people make mistakes. Nervous people cover their tracks. I took the folder, stood to leave, paused at the door. Thank you, I said. Frank nodded. Your sister was smart. She documented everything. Most victims never get that chance. She gave you the tools to finish what she started. Most victims. The word echoed in my mind all the way home. My sister was a victim of infidelity, of gaslighting, of murder, and tomorrow I would begin the process of making her killer pay. The morning of the will reading, I woke before dawn. I had not slept more than 2 hours. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Margot's face, her smile that never quite reached her eyes, her shoulders hunched, like the woman in her final painting. David was already awake. He sat on the edge of the bed, watching me. Are you ready? He asked. No. He nodded, took my hand, held it without speaking. I showered, dressed in a black suit that felt like armor. Applied makeup with steady hands that belied the chaos inside me. At 7 o'clock, I drove to Theodore Brennan's office. The building was old, dignified, the kind of place where fortunes had been managed for generations. Theodore had been our family attorney for 30 years. He had handled my parents' estates, My grandmother's trust. Every major financial decision the Ashford family had made in 3 decades. He was the perfect person to deliver justice. Garrett arrived early. Of course he did. He wore a dark suit. His hair was perfectly styled. His expression conveyed appropriate grief, tempered by practical resolve. "Caroline," he said, "thank you for arranging this. I know how difficult it must be." I said nothing, took my seat beside my parents. My mother's hand found mine under the table, squeezed tightly. Patricia Holloway entered the room, took a seat in the corner. Garrett frowned. "Who is this?" "An associate of the firm," Theodore said smoothly. "She will be observing today's proceedings." The frown deepened, but Garrett said nothing more. Theodore shuffled papers, cleared his throat. "Before we begin, I need to inform everyone that Mrs. Ashford created a secondary will in the months before her death." Garrett went still. "Secondary will? This document supersedes the original will that was created at the time of her marriage. It was witnessed and notarized according to all legal requirements. I was not informed of any secondary will." Theodore looked up, met Garrett's eyes. "You were not meant to be." Silence filled the room. I watched Garrett's face, watched the confusion transform into something darker. "This is highly irregular," he said. "Margot would have told me about something like this." "Would she?" Theodore asked mildly. The question hung in the air. Theodore began reading the legal preamble. The standard language of wills and estates, the declaration of sound mind, the revocation of all previous documents. Then he reached the bequests. "To my mother, Dorothy Ashford, I leave my grandmother's jewelry collection and the painting titled Sunrise at Cape May that I created for her 60th birthday." My mother let out a small sob. I squeezed her hand. "To my father, Walter Ashford, I leave my collection of first edition art books and the sketch I made of him teaching me to fish when I was 7. My father bowed his head. His shoulders shook with silent grief. "To my sister, Caroline Ashford Mercer, I leave my art studio, all its contents, and the responsibility of administering the Emma Rose Ashford Memorial Trust." Emma Rose. Margot had named her daughter Emma Rose. I had not known that. She had kept the name secret along with everything else. "To my husband, Garrett Ashford." The room held its breath. "I leave the following items." Theodore paused. Looked at Garrett with an expression that might have been satisfaction. One framed photograph of our wedding day, as a reminder of the vows he broke. Garrett's face went white. One printed copy of the text messages between him and Tiffany Vance, as documentation of his betrayal. His jaw clenched. His hands gripped the arms of his chair. And $1, representing the value of his integrity. Silence. Complete, suffocating silence. Then Garrett stood. His chair scraped against the floor with a sound like a scream. "This is insane," he said. She was not in her right mind. She was pregnant. Hormonal. She could not have known what she was doing. Theodore continued reading as if Garrett had not spoken. "All remaining assets, including the proceeds from my life insurance policy, my inheritance from my grandmother, and my share of the family trust, shall be placed in the Emma Rose Ashford Memorial Trust, dedicated to funding art education programs in underprivileged schools." Garrett's face turned from white to red. $4.2 million, Theodore added. "Administered by Caroline Ashford Mercer, none of which will go to Garrett Ashford." "I will contest this," Garrett shouted. "I will take this to every court in the country." She was not competent. She was manipulated. Theodore set down the will, folded his hands. "Mr. Ashford, your wife was examined by a psychiatrist before signing this document. She was found to be of sound mind. Every legal requirement was met and exceeded. Then someone coerced her. Someone filled her head with lies about me." Patricia Holloway stood, crossed to the table. Mrs. Ashford was not manipulated, she said. She was informed. She knew about your affair with Tiffany Vance. She documented it extensively. She knew about your financial misconduct at your firm. She documented that as well. Garrett's eyes darted to Patricia. Who the hell are you? I was your wife's attorney. I helped her prepare for the day she would need to protect herself and her child from you. This is a conspiracy. You have all conspired against me. No, Theodore said. This is the consequence of your actions. Your wife trusted you. You betrayed that trust. Now you face the result. Garrett's composure cracked. The mask slipped. For just a moment, I saw the real man underneath. Cold, calculating, furious. You will regret this, he said. All of you. The door opened behind him. A woman stepped into the room, badge visible on her belt. Garrett Ashford? I am Detective Maria Santos. I have some questions about a wire transfer made to Marcus Webb 2 days before your wife's death. The color drained from Garrett's face. I do not know what you are talking about. The detective smiled. It was not a kind smile. Then you will not mind coming down to the station to help us clear things up. Will you? She moved closer. Another officer appeared in the doorway behind her. Garrett Ashford, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. I watched my brother-in-law's face transform, confidence to confusion to fear. I had seen that look before, on my own ex-husband's face when I found his messages. That moment when they realize the mask has slipped, when they understand that they are not as clever as they thought. The officers led Garrett from the room. The door closed behind them. And for the first time since my sister's funeral, I could breathe. 1 month after the will reading, Garrett remained in custody. The investigation had moved quickly. Marcus Webb confessed within a week. Garrett had approached him through a mutual acquaintance, offered $10,000. Half up front, half after. The second payment never came. He said the husband was worried about his wife finding something, Detective Santos told me. Said she was asking too many questions, getting too close to the truth. Marcus Webb would spend 15 years in prison for vehicular homicide. Garrett faced charges of conspiracy to commit murder. The trial would take months, maybe years. But the evidence was overwhelming. Margot had seen to that. Tiffany Vance came forward as a witness. The mistress turned state's evidence. I watched her interview on the news, could not bring myself to look away. He told me she was controlling, Tiffany said. Cold, distant. He said the marriage was already over, that he stayed only for appearances. She wiped her eyes. Mascara streaked her cheeks. I believed him. God. I believed everything he said. I thought we would be together once the baby was born, once he had access to the trust fund. I did not know he was planning to hurt her. I turned off the television, sat in the darkness of my living room. The woman in red had not known about the murder, had been manipulated just as Margot had been, had loved a man who did not exist. I could not find it in my heart to hate her. Garrett had done the hating for all of us. 3 weeks later, I finally opened Margot's letter. I had been carrying it with me since the will reading, afraid to read it, afraid to hear my sister's voice for the last time. But the truth was waiting, and I could not hide from it forever. I sat in Margot's art studio, surrounded by her paintings. The smell of turpentine and linseed oil filled the air. I opened the envelope, unfolded the paper. Dear Caroline, if you are reading this, then something happened to me. I hoped I was being paranoid. I hoped I would burn this letter someday and laugh at myself for being so dramatic. But you are reading it, so I was right. Everything you need is in the flash drive. Evidence of his affair, his financial crimes, his plans to leave me and take the trust fund. I changed my will. Every penny goes to Emma. If Emma is not with us either, then everything goes to the Margot Ashford Foundation for Art Education. Garrett gets nothing. Do not feel guilty, Caroline. Do not spend years wondering if you could have saved me. I made my choices. I stayed too long. I hoped too much. I read those lines again. Let them sink into my bones. I made my choices. I stayed too long. I hoped too much. How many women had thought those same words? How many had blamed themselves for the cruelty of others? The only thing I need from you is this. Make sure he does not win. I love you. Tell Mom and Dad I love them. Tell Emma, wherever she is, that I loved her too. Your sister, Margot. I sat with the letter for a long time, read it over and over until I had memorized every word. Then I folded it carefully, once, twice, 3 times, slipped it into my wallet beside the photograph of Margot from our last vacation together, 2 sisters on a beach, both smiling, neither knowing what was coming. That night I visited my sister's grave for the first time since the funeral. 2 headstones stood side by side, white marble glowing in the moonlight. Margot Elaine Ashford, beloved daughter, sister, friend. Emma Rose Ashford, forever loved, forever remembered. I knelt between them, placed daisies on both, Margot's favorite flower. We got him, I whispered. He is going to prison, for a very long time. The wind picked up, rustled the leaves of the oak tree overhead. The foundation is being established. Dad is handling the paperwork. We are going to fund art programs in schools that cannot afford them. Your legacy is going to help thousands of kids. A car passed on the distant road. Headlights swept across the cemetery and disappeared. I found your journal. I read all of it. I know how scared you were at the end, how alone you felt. My voice cracked. I pressed my palm against the cold marble of Margot's headstone. I am so sorry I did not see it. I am so sorry I was not there for you. The guilt I had been carrying shifted, did not disappear, but changed shape. I could not save my sister, could not turn back time and pay attention to the signs I had missed, could not undo the damage that was done, but I could finish what she started. I could make sure her death meant something. I could make sure he did not win. I stayed at the cemetery until dawn, watched the stars fade and the sky turn pink with the first light of morning. When I finally stood, my legs were stiff from kneeling. My back ached. My eyes burned from crying. But something had shifted inside me. The grief was still there, would always be there. But now it had a purpose. I drove home as the sun rose, made coffee, sat at my kitchen table watching light fill the room. David found me there an hour later. He did not ask questions, just poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down across from me. I am going to run the foundation, I said. I know. I'm going to make it everything Margot wanted it to be. I know that too. I looked at my husband, the man who had stood beside me through every step of this nightmare. Thank you, I said, for believing me, for supporting me, for not thinking I was crazy. David reached across the table, took my hand. You are a lot of things, he said. Stubborn, determined, possibly slightly terrifying when you set your mind to something. But you are not crazy. I almost smiled, almost. She would have liked you, I said. Margot. She always said I was lucky to find you. I am the lucky one. Outside the window, birds sang in the early morning light. Inside, I felt the first stirrings of something I had not experienced since my sister died. Hope. 6 months passed. The trial began and ended. Marcus Webb testified against Garrett in exchange for a reduced sentence. Tiffany provided documentation of conversations she had overheard. The financial records Margot had gathered proved Garrett's embezzlement. The prosecution painted a picture of a calculating man who had married for money and killed to keep it. The defense tried to argue coincidence, bad luck. A web of circumstance that looked suspicious but proved nothing. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Guilty on all counts. Garrett was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. No possibility of parole. His parents stopped visiting after the first month. His colleagues refused to speak to reporters. His name became a cautionary tale, whispered at dinner parties. The man who killed his pregnant wife for her inheritance. The monster hiding behind a charming smile. I watched the sentencing from the back of the courtroom, sat beside my parents and Jolene and Patricia Holloway. We did not cheer when the verdict was read, did not celebrate when the judge handed down the sentence. Justice is not a celebration. Justice is a closing. After the trial, I threw myself into the foundation. The Margot Ashford Foundation for Art Education launched 3 months after the sentencing. First project? Renovating art rooms in 12 schools across the state. I spoke at the opening ceremony, stood at a podium in a gymnasium filled with teachers and parents and students. My sister believed that art saved lives, I said. She believed every child deserved the chance to create, to express, to find beauty in a world that can be very dark. I looked out at the faces watching me. Some I recognized. Most I did not. Margot did not get to see her daughter grow up. She did not get to teach her to paint butterflies and birds. She did not get to watch her reach for the stars. My voice cracked. I paused, steadied myself. But through this foundation, Margot will touch thousands of lives. Her legacy is not what was taken from her. Her legacy is what she built, what she left behind. A child in the front row raised her hand. I smiled. Yes? Did your sister paint those butterflies? The child pointed to a banner behind me, a reproduction of the nursery mural Margot had created for Emma. Butterflies and birds against a sunny yellow background. She did, I said. She painted them for her daughter. They are beautiful. They are, I agreed. She was very talented. The ceremony continued. Speeches were given. Ribbons were cut. Art supplies were distributed to wide-eyed children who had never owned their own paint set before. Afterward, a woman approached me in the parking lot. Mrs. Mercer? I turned. She was young, maybe 25, dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, paint stains on her jeans. I am sorry to bother you. I just wanted to say thank you. For what? I was one of Mrs. Ashford's students. 12 years ago, I was in her 5th grade art class. I studied her face, tried to see the child she had been. She changed my life. The woman continued. My family did not have money for art supplies. My parents thought art was a waste of time. But Mrs. Ashford, your sister, she saw something in me. The woman's eyes filled with tears. She bought me my first real sketchbook, stayed after school to teach me techniques, wrote me a recommendation for a summer art program that changed everything. What do you do now? I teach art. Middle school, in a district a lot like the one where I grew up. I blinked back my own tears. She would have loved that, I said, knowing that one of her students became a teacher. The woman smiled. She told me once that art is not about talent. It is about courage. The courage to put something out into the world that might be rejected or ridiculed or ignored. That sounds like Margot. She saved my life, Mrs. Mercer. And now her foundation is going to save other kids like me. I just wanted you to know that. The woman walked away, disappeared into the crowd. I stood in the parking lot for a long moment, let her words settle into my heart. Margot's legacy was not just the foundation, not just the money, not just the programs we would fund. Her legacy was the lives she had touched, the students she had inspired, the courage she had nurtured in others. She was still saving lives, even now. That evening, I visited the cemetery. The headstones gleamed white in the fading light. Fresh flowers from my mother, rested against the marble. I sat beside the graves, pulled my knees to my chest, watched the sun set behind the trees. "The trial is over," I said. "He got 30 years. He will be an old man when he gets out. If he gets out." A bird called somewhere in the distance. Another answered. "The foundation launched today. We funded 12 schools in the first round. There are applications from 40 more." I thought about the woman in the parking lot, the student Margot had saved. "You are still changing lives," I said, "still inspiring people, still making the world more beautiful." The wind picked up, carried the smell of autumn leaves and approaching rain. "I found your painting. The one you hid from me, two sisters on a beach." I smiled despite the tears running down my cheeks. "It hangs in my hallway now, right where the morning light hits first. I pass it every day on my way to work." I stood, brushed the grass from my pants. "I love you, Margot, both of you." I placed my hand on Emma's headstone, felt the cold marble beneath my palm, then I walked back to my car. Drove home through streets lined with trees wearing their autumn colors. The house was warm when I arrived, lit from within. David's car in the driveway, the sound of children laughing from the backyard. I stood on the porch for a moment, watching my family through the window. Lily was 10 now, almost the same age gap between us and Margot. She had Margot's love of art, spent hours in her room with sketchbooks and colored pencils. Jacob was 7, energetic, curious, convinced he was going to be an astronaut or a dinosaur hunter, or both. David stood at the kitchen counter, chopping vegetables for dinner. He looked up as I walked through the door, smiled. "How was it?" he asked. "Good. Hard, but good." He crossed the room, wrapped me in his arms. I pressed my face against his chest, let the warmth of his embrace seep into my bones. "She would be proud of you," he said. "I am just following her plan. We both know that is not true." I pulled it back, looked at my husband. "She gave me the puzzle pieces," I said. "I just put them together. You did more than that. You fought for her when no one else could. You made sure the world knew who Garrett really was. You turned her rage into something beautiful." I thought about Margot's letter, the words that had carried me through the darkest months. "Do not feel guilty. I made my choices. I stayed too long. I hoped too much." Maybe guilt was part of the journey. Maybe it was the price of loving someone you could not save. But maybe, too, there was a way through it, a way to honor the dead by helping the living, a way to transform grief into purpose. "Mom," Lily called from the backyard. "Come see what I drew." I took a breath, let it out slowly. "Coming?" I called back. I kissed David, walked through the house to the backyard where my children waited. The sun was setting. Golden light spilled across the grass. Lily held up a drawing for my approval. It was a butterfly. Bright colors against white paper, wings spread wide. "It is beautiful," I said. "Aunt Margot taught me how to draw butterflies," Lily said. "Remember?" I remember. I miss her. I knelt beside my daughter, brushed a strand of hair from her face. "I miss her too," I said. "But she is not really gone. She is in your drawings, in the foundation, in every child who learns to paint because of her." Lily considered this, nodded slowly. "That is a lot of places to be," she said. I smiled. "It is." She was a lot of woman. The evening stretched on. Dinner, homework, bedtime stories, the familiar rhythms of family life. But throughout it all, I felt Margot's presence, a warmth at my shoulder, a whisper in the wind. I did not believe in ghosts, not really, but I believed in legacy, and my sister's legacy was everywhere I looked. 1 year after Margot's funeral, the Emma Rose Ashford Memorial Scholarship was established. The first recipient was a 15-year-old named Maria Gonzalez. She lived in public housing with her grandmother, had never owned art supplies that were not hand-me-downs. dreamed of becoming an art therapist. I met her on the day of the dedication ceremony. The community center was packed. Folding chairs filled every inch of available space. Parents and teachers and local officials crowded against the walls. Maria sat in the front row, small, nervous, her hands twisted in her lap. I approached the podium. My sister believed in second chances, I said. She believed in new beginnings. She believed in the power of art to heal what words cannot reach. I looked at Maria, saw the hope and fear battling in her eyes. She would have been so proud of today, proud of this scholarship, proud of the young woman who is receiving it. I gestured for Maria to join me at the podium. She approached slowly, uncertain. I handed her the certificate, a check that would fund her education through college, a letter explaining what the scholarship represented. Margot once told me that art is not about talent, I said. It is about courage. The courage to put something out into the world that might be rejected or ridiculed or ignored. I looked at Maria. You have that courage. My sister would have seen it in you, just as I see it now. Maria burst into tears, not sad tears, overwhelmed tears, the kind that come when hope becomes real. The audience applauded. Camera flashes went off. My mother wiped her eyes with a handkerchief. Afterward, a woman approached me in the hallway. Mrs. Mercer, I am Patricia Holloway. I shook her hand. We had spoken many times since the trial, but this was the first time we had met in person since the will reading. Thank you for coming, I said. I would not have missed it. She paused. Your sister would have loved this. I know. Patricia reached into her bag, pulled out an envelope. She asked me to give you something. After the foundation was established, I looked at the envelope. My name in Margot's handwriting. Another letter? Patricia smiled. She wanted to make sure you knew how proud she was, how grateful, how much she loved you. I took the envelope, held it carefully. Thank you for everything you did for her. She was remarkable, Patricia said. She knew exactly what she wanted, exactly how to protect the people she loved. She paused, met my eyes. I have worked with many women in situations like hers. Most never get the chance to plan ahead, to document the truth, to ensure justice. Margot did. Margot did, Patricia agreed. And because of that, her story has a different ending than most. I thought about all the women whose stories did not end this way, whose husbands went free, whose evidence was never found, whose deaths were ruled accidental. We are launching a legal aid program, I said. Part of the foundation. Free consultations for women who suspect their partners might harm them. Patricia's expression shifted. Respect, admiration. Margot would have loved that. I hope so. I held the envelope all the way home. Did not open it. Wanted to read it in private, in the studio, surrounded by Margot's paintings. That evening, I sat in the space that had been her sanctuary. The smell of turpentine still lingered. Her brushes still stood in their jar by the window. The painting of the lonely woman still hung on the wall. I opened the envelope. Dear Caroline, if you are reading this, then the foundation exists. Emma's memory lives on. And I hope, I really hope, that Garrett is facing justice. I want you to know something. In those last months, when I was planning and gathering evidence and trying to protect Emma, I was not afraid. I was angry. I was heartbroken, but I was not afraid, because I knew you would be there. I knew you would finish what I started. I knew you would turn my rage into something beautiful. That is what sisters do. I do not know what happens after we die, but if I am somewhere watching, I want you to know this. I am proud of you. I am grateful for you, and I am at peace. Live your life, Caroline. Really live it. Fall in love with David again every day. Watch Lily grow up. Create things that matter. And sometimes, when you are in the studio, talk to me. I will be listening, all my love, forever. Margot, P.S. I left one more painting hidden. behind the canvas of the woman in the garden. It is for you. I set down the letter, crossed to the painting on the wall, the lonely woman in the garden, shoulders hunched, face turned away. I had looked at this painting 100 times since finding the studio, had always seen only loneliness and grief. But now I looked closer. The woman was not hunched in defeat. She was bent over, hands in the soil, planting something. Seeds, new growth. I lifted the canvas from the wall, turned it over. Behind it, taped to the back of the frame, was a smaller canvas. I pulled it free, held it up to the light. Two girls on a beach, one older, one younger, holding hands. Looking at the sunrise, the title was written in the corner in Margot's careful handwriting, Sisters. I held the painting against my chest, laughed, cried, felt my sister's presence so strongly it took my breath away. I hear you, I whispered. I will always hear you. The next morning, I hung the painting in my hallway, right next to the window where the morning light hit first. Every day I passed it on my way to work. Every day I touched the frame, a greeting, a promise, a reminder that love does not end, it just changes form. 2 years after Margot's death, the foundation reached 50 schools. Art programs that had been cut due to budget constraints were restored. Teachers who had been buying supplies out of their own pockets received grants. Students who had never held a real paintbrush were creating masterpieces. I traveled to each school personally, met with principals and teachers and parents, watched children discover the joy of creation. In Detroit, a 9-year-old named Marcus showed me a painting of his family, his mother, his grandmother, his baby brother, all rendered in bright primary colors. "This is beautiful," I told him. He beamed. Mrs. Ashford's class taught me how to mix colors. I never knew you could make orange from yellow and red. I thought about Margot, about all the children she had taught, about the ones she would never teach. "You have real talent," I said. "Keep painting." He nodded solemnly. "I will." In Philadelphia, a 15-year-old named Jasmine shared her portfolio with me. Sketches of city streets, portraits of her neighbors, abstract pieces expressing emotions she could not put into words. "I want to go to art school," she said, "but my parents do not have the money." "Apply for our scholarship," I told her. "You have exactly the kind of talent my sister believed in." Her eyes widened. "Really? Really?" In Chicago, a teacher named Mrs. Washington showed me her transformed classroom, new easels, professional quality paints, a digital drawing tablet for students interested in graphic design. "Your sister's foundation changed everything," she said. "We had nothing before. Now we have everything." I looked around the room, at the artwork covering every wall, at the students bent over their projects, completely absorbed. "This is what she wanted," I said. "This is why she did what she did." Mrs. Washington touched my arm. Her sacrifice was not in vain. No, it was not. The legal aid program expanded in year 2. We partnered with law firms across the country to provide free consultations for women in dangerous situations. The program was named the Patricia Holloway Initiative, in honor of the attorney who had helped Margot plan her escape. Patricia herself served on the advisory board. She reviewed cases, trained young attorneys, made sure no woman who reached out was turned away. 300 women received help in the first year. Escape plans were developed. Assets were protected. Children were safeguarded. 12 of those women were later killed by their partners. The number haunted me. 300 helped, 12 lost. But the alternative was worse. Without the program, how many more would have died? How many would have faced the fate Margot almost faced? Without anyone to finish their story. In year 3, we opened a shelter. The Margot Ashford House, a converted Victorian in a quiet neighborhood, 6 bedrooms, room for 12 women and their children. I spoke at the opening. My sister knew what it was like to live with fear, I said. To smile for the world while your heart was breaking. To wonder if tonight would be the night everything fell apart. The audience was quiet, attentive. Women who had lived the same story. She did not have a safe place to go. She had money and family and resources, and still she felt trapped. Imagine how much worse it is for women who have none of those things. I looked at the house behind me, freshly painted, warm lights glowing in the windows. This is Margot's gift to them, a place to be safe, a place to plan, a place to start over. A woman in the front row raised her hand. I nodded. Yes? What would your sister say if she could see this? I thought about Margot, her gentle smile, her fierce love, her refusal to let Garrett win even after death. She would say it is not enough, I said honestly. She would say there should be 1,000 shelters, 1,000,000 shelters, safe places for every woman who needs one. The woman nodded slowly. But she would also be proud, I continued, proud that her story helped others, proud that her death meant something, proud that she is still saving lives. The shelter opened the following week. Within a month, all 6 bedrooms were full. By year 5, the Margot Ashford Foundation had grown beyond anything I could have imagined. 230 schools served, 47,000 students reached, a legal aid program operating in 30 states, 3 shelters open with 4 more planned, and 1 prisoner in a federal institution who would spend the next 25 years thinking about what he had lost. Garrett's appeal was denied in year 2. His parents sold their home to pay his legal fees and moved to Florida to escape the shame. Tiffany Vance changed her name, relocated to another city, tried to build a life free from the shadow of her choices. I did not follow her story, did not want to know what happened to her. She was not the villain. She was another victim. Garrett was the villain, and Garrett was exactly where he belonged. 5 years after Margot's funeral, I returned to her grave. The headstones had weathered slightly, names softened by rain and sun and time, but the flowers I placed there every week remained fresh. I sat in my usual spot, pulled my knees to my chest, watched clouds drift across the September sky. She wore red to your funeral, I said aloud, remember. Walked right down the aisle on Garrett's arm, like she owned the place. The wind rustled the leaves of the oak tree overhead. But you wore white to her court hearing, metaphorically speaking. I smiled at my own joke. Margot would have appreciated it. The foundation reached 50,000 students this year. We are expanding to 3 more states. A butterfly landed on Emma's headstone, orange and black wings catching the sunlight. It lingered for a moment, then flew away. Garrett's up for parole in 20 years. The parole board already knows about us. We will be there to make sure he serves every day of his sentence. Somewhere in the distance, children laughed. A playground nearby, the sound of joy carrying across the cemetery. Lily wants to be an art teacher. Can you believe it? She says Aunt Margot inspired her. I reached out, touched the cool marble of Margot's headstone. I found the painting, I said. The one you hid. Sisters. It hangs in my hallway now. Every morning I pass it. Every morning I think of you. The clouds parted. Sunlight warmed my face. I miss you, I said. Every single day. But I am okay. The kids are okay. Mom and Dad are okay. We are all going to be okay. I stood, brushed the grass from my pants. A woman walked through the cemetery toward me. Young, maybe 25, wild hair, paint-stained jeans. She stopped beside the graves, looked at the headstones. Margot Ashford? I nodded. My sister. The woman's eyes filled with tears. She was my teacher. 5th grade. She changed my life. I looked at the stranger who carried a piece of my sister inside her. She changed a lot of lives, I said. I have a gallery showing next month, my first one. I wanted to invite her. I thought about Margot, about how proud she would have been. She would have loved that, I said. She always said her students were her greatest achievement. The woman wiped her eyes. I am sorry for your loss. Thank you. She walked away, disappeared among the headstones. I watched her go, felt Margot's presence beside me. Another life you touched, I whispered. Another person you inspired. The wind picked up, carried the scent of autumn leaves and approaching rain. I think about you sometimes, I said, in the quiet moments, before I fall asleep, when I wake up, during long drives when my mind wanders. I think about what might have been, if you had lived, if Emma had been born, if we had grown old together, two sisters watching our children play. I think about the unfairness of it, the cruelty, the waste, but then I think about what you did, how you planned, how you documented, how you made sure that even in death you would win. And I am so proud of you, Margot. So incredibly proud. I placed the daisies on her headstone, straightened the ones on Emma's grave. I love you, I said. Both of you. Forever. I walked back to my car, drove home through streets lined with trees, wearing their autumn colors. The house was warm when I arrived. The sound of my family inside. David, Lily, Jacob. The life I had built from the ashes of tragedy. I stood on the porch for a moment, watching through the window. Lily sat at the kitchen table, drawing, her tongue poked out in concentration, just like Margot's always did. Jacob demonstrated something energetically to David, hands waving, face alight with excitement. David looked up, saw me through the window, smiled, I smiled back. Then I walked inside, into the warmth, into the light, into the life that Margot had fought to protect. The painting hung in the hallway where it always did. Two sisters on a beach, holding hands, looking at the sunrise. I touched the frame as I passed. A greeting, a promise, a reminder. Hey, Margot, I whispered. The painting seemed to glow in the afternoon light. I did it, I said. Everything you asked. He did not win. From the kitchen, Lily called out, Mom, come see what I drew. I took a breath, let it out slowly. Coming, sweetheart, I called back. I walked toward my family, toward my life, toward the future Margot had paid for with her own. Behind me, the painting watched. Two sisters, forever together, even now. If this story moved you, if you felt Margot's courage and Caroline's determination in your heart, please take a moment to hit that like button. Drop a comment below and tell me what you would have done in Caroline's situation. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that they are not alone. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel and tap that notification bell so you never miss another story. Your engagement helps these stories reach women who need them most. Every like, every share, every comment, it all matters. Closing statement. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. We believe in the power of storytelling to inspire, educate, and empower. Thank you for being part of this community.